The Book of Lost Friends is one of your most celebrated recent releases and is actually based on another true story. Tell us about the roots of this one and what really compelled you to want to put it on paper.
Every book for me starts with a spark, and I don't ever know. If I went looking for the sparks, I would probably never find them. It's always something that I trip across in everyday life, or that somebody brings into my path or whatever. So the Book of Lost Friends, I was in a committed relationship with another manuscript that was to be my next book. I had written it. The rough draft is always me telling the story to me. And then the second draft is me getting the story ready for someone else to be able to read it. So I had written the first draft of that book before I went on tour for Before We Were Yours. By the time I made it home from tour, Before We Were Yours was hitting the bestseller lists and all that sort of thing. So my task when I finally got home was to edit the manuscript for the book that I was writing, that I had written the rough draft to. And I was out on the porch, and I loved that book. I loved the piece of history it was based on, etc. But I had written the rough draft for it. I was home to edit it. I was procrastinating, which people ask if I get writer's block. I don't. I get writer's procrastination. I say it's like sitting down to take the ACT test every time. So I was procrastinating. I was looking through the email, and I opened an email from a reader who said, "I've just read Before We Were Yours, and the separated families in the story remind me of some work I've been doing for the Historic New Orleans Collection Museum." And to the bottom of this note, she attached these old scans of these old ads from the late 1800s in this blotchy newsprint of hand crank printing presses, creased and faded and with little dots of ink. And what these were ads placed by formerly enslaved people after the Civil War who had been separated from their families during slavery. And this was an ingenious, sort of like an early day social media page, because this was an ingenious way of giving the last known information they had about their families and sending these out into this fractious, divided country, on steamboats up the river and in the mailbags of rural mail carriers, to see if anyone out there had news of their people and could send it back to them and reconnect these families. So that was the basis of the Book of Lost Friends, were these ads.
It's sad in our history, but there were actually 2,500 of these advertisements placed by free slaves looking for relatives. How did you decide which in your research to put in the book?
The woman who brought it to me, the museum volunteer, Diane Plochet, who's from New Orleans, what she said in her original note was every one of these ads is a story. And so from the ones she had attached to her note, I went to the database and I just fell down the well of the stories of these people whose names likely exist nowhere in the world anymore. It's enough generations that these names are often forgotten by family. These people were probably mostly buried in graves that were marked with something wooden or not marked at all. So they are gone from the earth. And these ads survive in dusty file cabinets of university archives and the back rooms of libraries where some editions of this newspaper have been donated or whatever. And these people who did the Lost Friends collection gather these up from all these different places. They're still finding some of them, and they make this database. And so I started reading through these stories, and I was fascinated by these pictures of these people's lives and what happened. And so I emailed her back and said, I'd like to know more about your work. This is definitely something I would write about, but I thought it would be my next story. I would finish the one that was already written, and then this would be my next book. And so she would send me interesting ads as she was digitizing new ones. And one day she sent me the ad of a woman named Caroline Flowers. And it was a very long and detailed ad. And it was the story of Caroline. Now, she's writing this when she's an older woman, decades later. But it was the story of her childhood in which her family, her large family, is stolen by a nephew of the plantation owner. And he flees with this large family basically taken captive. And as he's fleeing, he's selling them off to get away with it and put the money in his pocket. They used to call it putting him in your pocket, which meant you sold an enslaved person for the money. And so he's putting them in his pocket as he travels, and this family ends up separated by this process. And so the ad is Caroline, who was a little child at the time this happened, giving the details of everything she knows and remembers decades later of what happened to her family in this flight. Now, Caroline's real life ad is from Texas to Louisiana. I did the reverse in the story. This Hanny's story, the fictional Caroline, begins in Louisiana, down along the river road, South Louisiana, and the flight is to Texas. So it's the reverse trajectory, but it's based on what happened to Caroline's family.
Please tell us about your real-life muse, Hanny Gossett, and how you brought her remarkable character to life on the page.
Everything in Hanny's story comes out of research. I love historians, but I don't like to research from history books. I like to research from narratives of the time period.
Interesting.
Because historians are great, but when you're studying a history book, there is still the filter of the person who's writing it. So, I don't really want history through a modern filter of what the historian decides is important to include. I want to go back and read what the people with the lived experience said. Fortunately, in the topic of slavery, we have the Federal Writers Project, who during the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, some people built bridges for the WPA, some people built gymnasiums and armories. Some people, writers and artists, were hired to go out into the country and take down the stories of ordinary people. And they fanned out and did this. And one of the sub-projects of this were the slave narratives, where the WPA writers interviewed the last survivors of slavery who remember it firsthand. It's one of the places where we get, one of the few places where we get the true stories of slavery. And what people experienced, what their lives, what is somebody when they're doing a 3 or 4 page interview at the end of their life, what do they recall? What seems important to them to tell? And so Hanny's story comes partly from the ad, but a lot of her details come from the slave narratives, because there's stuff in there you won't read in any history book, like the fact that there were these minor children left everywhere with no blood relatives when emancipation happens. And there were parents who walked on foot all over the country to the last known locations of their children, trying to gather up their family.